But with that situation, there was a shooting, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
So you shot at, was it at Snoop or?
It was at his studio.
Okay, so
It was a shooting that took place at his studio in Diamond Bar. If you're not really the factor who you proclaim to be, a lot of times you will become a victim.
Snoop Dogg thought he was untouchable. By the early 2000s, he'd survived death row's chaos, beef with Suge Knight, and the wildest era of gangsta rap.
Do you worry about Suge getting out of jail?
No worries at all. Why, you worried for me?
Yeah, kinda.
Why?
Well, you know, some people say he's not really a nice man.
He was bigger than the game. Part rapper, part brand, part cultural icon. But even the biggest names can make one fatal mistake, crossing the wrong man. That man was Tray Deee.
I've always been a gangster since I became affiliated.
Okay.
And I've never been non-affiliated, so I've never stopped being a gangster.
Tray Deee wasn't just a rapper. He was certified, a street figure who played by a different set of rules.
I had one drug charge, and then I had like 6 firearm charges, like back to back to back.
For him, loyalty wasn't a music industry buzzword. It was a way of life.
Don't have nothing to fear from me except you trying to over me.
And when he realized Snoop had been keeping the biggest bag for himself, he didn't just take offense, he took action. The betrayal was not just about money, it was about respect. Snoop had built Tha Eastsidaz as a movement, but the man who helped shape it felt played. And Tray Deee wasn't the type to just let that slide. This is how a financial dispute nearly turned into a street war. How Snoop Dogg, the biggest name in West Coast rap, found himself on the wrong side of a gangster rapper with nothing to lose. Tha Eastsidaz was supposed to be a brotherhood. That was the pitch. Snoop was bringing together Tray Deee and Goldie Lock, two street-certified voices.
Snoop asked me beforehand, he said, because me, him, and Daz were going to be the Eastsidaz originally, when he was going through all the rigmarole with Death Row, and think Daz stayed there, so they falling out or whatever. So when he came back from No Limit, he was like, homie, I still want to do that Eastsider thing. What you think about doing it with Goldie?
To resurrect that unfiltered West Coast gangster rap energy. And it worked. The debut album titled Tha Eastsidaz dropped in 2000 and it exploded.
I figured once they knew who we were, when we were authentic West Coast gangsters, then it would just grow organically like that.
It did grow organically. Platinum plaques, magazine covers, that G-funk sound woven with harder, unrelenting street narratives. It was the kind of record that put Long Beach back on the map, that reminded people where Snoop came from. He wasn't just the laid-back stoner cracking jokes in interviews, he was still connected, still respected.
We've been accredited with that, being there for him and, giving him an anchor. Really like to come back and establish itself.
And yet, for all the success, for all the money that Tha Eastsidaz was supposed to be making, something didn't add up. Tray Deee saw it first. It was in the numbers, what they were being paid versus what they knew the albums were pulling in. Gold records sold out shows, but their pockets weren't reflecting the success. Meanwhile, Snoop was living good. Not just good, great. Mansion, Bentley's endorsements, Tray Deee and Goldie Lock, not so much. At first, it was easy to brush off. Labels had always been shady with contracts. Maybe it was just industry politics. But the more Tray Deee looked, the more he questioned, the more it started to feel personal.
It was, when I left, it was a little tension between us behind a contractual dispute where me and homie Goldie weren't really afforded our percentage. And
he had been loyal. More than that, he had trusted. And that's where the real problem started. Friendship and business had mixed, and now the lines were blurring. Where was the money? Who had signed what? Snoop had been the bridge, the mentor, the one who vouched for them. But as the reality sank in, as the paychecks kept coming up short, that bridge started to crack. Tray Deee realized the contractual agreement wasn't favorable to them, but he wasn't one to just let things slide.
The dispute I had, and it was like...
That was Snoop?
Yeah. It was like, well, regardless of who put what in the paperwork or what I didn't expect or I imagined that it would go a particular way, I still had to own up to the fact that I put my signature on that contract.
At first, Tray Deee wasn't accusing Snoop outright, but he needed clarity. The problem was, clarity wasn't coming. Every conversation led to more finger-pointing. Snoop wasn't taking the blame and neither was anyone else.
We just decided that, we would try to ameliorate the situation at that time, but no moves were made to actually make it happen. And, that caused a big explosion.
The classic industry shuffle. But Tray Deee wasn't the type to just let things go. Goldie Locke felt it too. He wasn't as confrontational as Tray Deee, but he knew something was off. And the deeper they pushed, the clearer it became. Snoop was benefiting from the group in ways they weren't. Not just financially, but in reputation. Tha Eastsidaz had given Snoop a renewed credibility, a reason for the streets to rally behind him again. And yet, when it came time to split the rewards, it felt like they were left with scraps. Tray Deee started connecting dots. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe it was an oversight, or maybe it was something worse. Loyalty was one thing, but business was business, and right now, it felt like they were on the wrong side of the deal. He started vocalizing his frustrations, not just behind closed doors, but publicly. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Tha Eastsidaz wasn't just facing a business dispute, it was unraveling. Now Tray Deee was not the kind of guy you tested. Not in Long Beach, not in the 90s, and certainly not if you were a rapper dabbling in gang culture without truly living it.
I've never stopped being a gangster. I just became a rapper along my journey of gangsterism.
He wasn't about colors for the sake of music videos or throwing up signs because it looked good on an album cover. No, Tray Deee was cut from a different cloth, woven in the streets, hardened by experience, and sharpened like a blade on the grindstone of survival. Before the rap game, before the industry even knew his name, Tracy Lamar Davis was already a problem in Long Beach. The kind of problem that made people cross the street when they saw him coming. He wasn't just affiliated with the East Side Crips. He embodied what it meant to move with power in that world. He didn't just claim a set, he enforced it. His reputation wasn't built on rap beefs or Twitter threats. It came from real-life run-ins, from the way people whispered his name in certain corners, from the fact that when Tray Deee was around, things could go left at any second. And he wasn't some knucklehead with a gun and an attitude. He was calculated. That's what made him dangerous. This was a man who made a living robbing drug dealers. Not once, not twice, but as a full-time occupation.
I would rob dope dealers as a habit, when I caught them outside, they neighborhood. And in my neighborhood, mostly.
He didn't just stick up random nobodies. He targeted those who were getting money, people who thought they had security. If someone was slipping, if their setup was weak, if they had a name but not the muscle to protect it, Tray Deee would find them, and when he did, it wasn't just about taking their money. It was about making sure they knew exactly who did it. There's a story he told about robbing a guy in his own neighborhood. Months later, they ran into each other at a fish fry. The man who had been robbed, a hustler who wasn't exactly soft, was shaking like a leaf just standing near him.
I ran into a guy at a fish fry that I robbed about 2-3 months after I robbed him. He was shaking like a leaf.
That was the effect Tray Deee had. You didn't just take a loss and move on when he was the one who took from you. You lived with it. You carried the memory like an old wound that never fully healed. That wasn't fear based on rumors. That was firsthand experience. He never cared about the long game of flipping money, about stacking up and moving into a different lifestyle. He was about immediate results. If he hit a lick, he wasn't thinking about investing it into a business or turning it into something legitimate. No, he'd spend it, live large for a moment, then go right back out and get more. That was the cycle. And that's why he never trusted the dope game. Sitting in a trap house, waiting on buyers, watching the door, hoping the police or someone like himself didn't come crashing through, that wasn't his speed. He'd rather be the one kicking in the door.
Wasn't really never the dope dealer, but in certain of my crimes, I would have dope. So, I have a fire sale on dope.
People who knew him, who really understood what he was about, never took him lightly. He also once threw a chair at a judge after being sentenced to 5 years at just 14 years old.
I threw a chair at the judge when I got sentenced to 5 years in the youth authority. I was 14 years old.
That wasn't an act of defiance. It was a glimpse into the kind of fire that burned inside him. 5 years at 14? That's the kind of start that either breaks you or forges you into something lethal. Tray Deee wasn't broken. His reputation stretched beyond Long Beach, beyond the West Coast. He had little homies taking his name and carrying it like a banner, not just because they admired him, but because they believed in the power it held. So when Tray Deee stepped into the rap game, he didn't leave that mindset behind. He brought it with him. There's another story, one that happened right in Snoop's own house. Tyron Turner, the actor from Menace to Society, recalled a night when things got physical. Snoop's house was a gathering spot, a place where people hung out, smoked, talked business, and sometimes played rough. Wrestling, slapboxing, just a way for the homies to test each other's heart without it turning into something serious. One night, Tyron and Tray Deee locked up in one of these friendly matches, except it wasn't so friendly. Tyron, who wasn't exactly a lightweight himself, admitted that in that moment he realized Tray Deee wasn't like the rest. This wasn't about ego, it was just reality. Tray Deee was a strong man.
Tray Deee is the homie, very strong. I respect Tray Deee. That's my guy. Like he's an OG in the hood.
That's what made Snoop's misstep so dangerous. Because while Snoop was the face of Long Beach, the friendly, charismatic icon that made gang culture digestible for the mainstream, Tray Deee was the weight behind it. He was the real deal. And when Snoop started making moves that disrespected that reality, when lines were crossed, there was no laughing it off. Snoop had played with fire before, but this was an inferno. When Snoop Dogg kept avoiding Tray Deee and wouldn't provide clarity on their financial standing, Tray felt he had been silent long enough. The frustration had simmered past the point of quiet resentment. It was one thing to fall out with a friend. It was another to be cut off completely, left to starve in the same streets they used to conquer together. And for what? Over money? Over promises that suddenly didn't mean anything once the deals were signed, the records sold, and the checks cashed. While Snoop Dogg basked in the success of his ever-growing empire, Tray Deee was back in the trenches, struggling to pull together something of his own. Tha Eastsidaz had been a powerhouse, a force that cemented their presence in the West Coast scene. But when the contracts dried up and the money stopped flowing, there was nothing left but a bad taste in the mouth and a growing realization. Snoop wasn't coming back for them. He wasn't reaching out. And Tray Deee wasn't one to beg. What started as hushed grumblings between old friends turned into a firestorm. There were no more private conversations, no more behind-the-scenes negotiations. Tray Deee began speaking his mind, and when words weren't enough, actions followed. It was an open secret in the streets. Snoop had burned bridges, and now the consequences were knocking on his door. Literally, Snoop's studio became a target. The place where he built his sound wasn't safe anymore. Shots rang out, and they were not random or accidental. It was personal.
And one y'all should know, he went up there and shot up Snoop's studio/home in San Dimas, Diamond Bar, San Dimas. So here it is, they're both out there starving. They don't got no money, they don't got no assets, Goldie Loc and Tray Deee. So Tray Deee in the hood.
Security fought back. One of Snoop's men, someone tied to the same neighborhood politics that made this situation so messy, returned fire.
Oh, but one of his security shot at me initially.
Ah, okay.
You know what I mean?
Ah, okay.
And, I responded in kind.
It was a standoff without a body count, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Interviews followed, the tension spilling into the public. Tray Deee didn't hold back, calling out Snoop in ways that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about respect, about loyalty, about what happens when you turn your back on the people who stood beside you in the war zone. Snoop, on the other hand, wasn't built for this kind of warfare. Not anymore. He had spent years carefully distancing himself from the violence, transforming into a larger-than-life figure that existed beyond the confines of gang culture. He wasn't the same kid from 21st Street. He had learned that survival in the industry required reinvention, not retaliation. So he didn't retaliate, he deflected. There were no direct responses, no diss tracks with his name attached. Snoop kept moving, kept elevating, but in the background, the pressure mounted. Tray Deee wasn't backing down, and the streets were watching. It could have gone further. It could have spiraled into something neither of them could come back from. But Tray Deee, despite his reputation, wasn't reckless. He knew the difference between street justice and self-destruction. He had already done time, already played the game long enough to understand that some wars weren't worth fighting the old way. Instead, he went the legal route. He pursued legal action, knowing full well that it wasn't the most gangster move, but it was the smartest. There was money still owed, and if he wasn't going to get it in the streets, he would get it in court. Snoop, ever the businessman, handled it exactly how you'd expect. Silence, distance, legal teams, whatever it took to avoid the spectacle of a full-blown feud that could taint his carefully curated brand. And in a way, that was its own kind of victory. Tray Deee had forced him to respond, forced him to acknowledge the problem, if not publicly, then behind closed doors. However, Tray Deee made a dangerous move in 2003 that kept him locked away for the next decade. He shot at a rival gang member in a moment that got escalated.
Yeah, it was just a situation where some guys pulled up on me and, they was playing and I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
They stopping by my car and, flexing and, exposing, and I just wasn't having none of it, so
okay.
I sent them on their way.
When the dust settled, the court didn't see a street soldier defending his name. It saw a repeat offender. The sentence came down hard, 12 years in prison. Just like that, the wave he had been riding, Tha Eastsidaz, the music, the money, the recognition, crashed into cold steel bars. And with that, Snoop Dogg moved on. When a rapper vanishes, especially to prison, he doesn't just lose time. He loses presence. Tray Deee, once a dominant voice in the West Coast's gangster rap resurgence, was now a cautionary tale. Another talented street general sidelined by the very life he rapped about. Snoop, ever the survivor, pivoted. He had seen the walls close in before, had beaten his own murder charge in the 90s. He knew how this worked. Tray Dee's absence wasn't just a personal loss, it was a business problem. Snoop kept moving, kept working, kept evolving. The game demanded it. The industry wasn't built for pauses. For Tray Deee, prison wasn't just a setback, it was a reckoning. Sitting in a cell, stripped of everything but time and reflection, he had no choice but to confront his past.
It was a learning lesson, I was able to go in there and, recalibrate and calculate my life to follow a better path.
The streets had been good to him, but they had also been merciless. He had spent years balancing on a razor's edge, trying to be both an artist and a gangster. But the scales had tipped, and now he had a decade to think about why. Inside, Tray Deee did what he had always done in the downtime between chaos. He wrote rhymes, strategies, plans for what came next.
When I would go to jail, I would spend my time, studying, scheming, writing up rhymes, and politicking, doing what I had to do to stay solid.
He took stock of his choices, the path that had led him here. The moment of clarity didn't come all at once, but as the years passed, a realization settled in. He had been playing a game with rules that weren't made for him to win. The world outside didn't stop moving. Snoop expanded his empire. More music, more businesses, a whole reinvention. The gangster rap era that Tray Deee had helped shape was shifting. The industry was changing. By the time he was nearing release, rap had evolved into something almost unrecognizable from the world he left behind. But he wasn't bitter. If anything, prison had sharpened him, given him perspective. Tray Deee had once chased dual crowns, the feared gangster and the respected rapper. Now he understood something that they couldn't coexist. One would always consume the other. And in 2003, his choice had been made for him. Prison had taken his freedom, but it had given him something in return: clarity. A decade earlier, Tray Deee had been convinced he could live in both worlds. Now he knew better, and that knowledge would shape everything that came next. Tray Deee did what few expected. He let the past be the past. After years of hostility, misunderstandings, and a near-fatal feud that could have cemented an eternal rift between him and Snoop Dogg, the two eventually found common ground. The beef, once laced with bullets and bad blood, had simmered down into something resembling peace. Not just a ceasefire, but an understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of history, of mistakes, and ultimately, of brotherhood.
We have a situation, but it's a situation that we taking time to resolve as we do.
Tray Deee even made the first move. 5 years had passed since the tension peaked. 5 years since loyalties had been questioned and friendships had been shattered by contracts and gunfire. It was during a casual day in Hollywood when the phone call happened. Not a dramatic sit-down, not a staged moment for a documentary, just a phone call. One moment, Tray Deee was talking to a mutual friend, Snoop's longtime hair braider. Next thing he knew, the dog father himself was on the line.
I was shopping somewhere in Hollywood, and I'll call the homegirl Tasha. She used to braid our hair. She still braid his hair, or she still do his hair. He got the locks now, but she was like, "I'm right here with Snoop right now."
And just like that, 5 years of hostility melted away in a matter of minutes. It would have been easy to let pride take the wheel, to let the scars of the past dictate the future. But Tray Deee had done time. 12 years behind bars. If prison teaches you anything, it's how precious time is. And Snoop had transitioned into something bigger than the streets. The man went from Crip anthems to cooking shows with Martha Stewart, from death row's most controversial artist to a universally beloved icon. He had no time for petty drama. Of course, squashing the beef didn't mean erasing the past. The history was still there. The old wounds, the what-ifs, the bullets fired in anger, none of that disappeared overnight. But there's a difference between forgetting and forgiving. They chose to forgive. Some might say it was just good business. That staying cool with Snoop was a smart move for Tray Deee after his release, and maybe it was. But listen to how they talk about each other now. There's no tension, no cold professionalism masking unspoken resentment. When Tray Deee speaks on Snoop, there's respect in his voice. Not force, not rehearsed, just genuine. He acknowledges Snoop's grind, the way he carries himself, the way he built an empire without selling out his roots. And Snoop hasn't forgotten what Tray Deee did for him, way back when they were young, reckless, and moving as a unit. There's a moment that speaks volumes about their bond. A moment that goes beyond contracts and misunderstandings. Before any of the drama, before the fallout, before the near-deadly clash at the studio, Tray Deee once saved Snoop's life. It happened at the filming of the New York video. They were chilling inside a trailer, smoking, talking, just another day on set. Then, out of nowhere, glass shattered. A sniper had taken a shot, and in that split second, instinct kicked in. Tray Deee didn't think, he just moved. He grabbed Snoop and threw him to the floor, shielding him from another potential shot.
Got up to pass me the blunt, and it was like, I was like, I heard something. And then, and the window shattered. And so I grabbed Snoop and threw him on the floor, and I'm like, they shooting. And Superfly, Corrupt, everybody just got down on the floor. Security came, they was on point.
That's what real loyalty looked like. It's easy to rewrite history, to let beefs overshadow the moments that really mattered. But when you go through something like that together, it stays with you. No amount of business disputes, misunderstandings, or years of silence could erase that kind of loyalty. So, are they best friends again? Not exactly. There's a difference between being cool and being inseparable. They're not running around like they did in the death row days. They're not making plans every week. But there's peace, there's mutual respect, and sometimes that's more important than anything else.